Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you. I don't remember exactly the last time we had an episode, probably maybe last Wednesday or Thursday. So it's been about a week. We have a busy schedule this week. We have this one today. Tomorrow is scheduled to be a conversation with a couple of members of Palestinian youth movement. Uh, I have to talk with them a little bit because we may move it to audio or not live. So that may or may not air tomorrow, but check to make sure. And I'll confirm that later today. Um, and we will have the conversation either way. It just, we didn't discuss format, and that was my fault for doing that. Then on Friday, Laura Shihai will be back. I have to get that posted, but we're gonna have a conversation on Friday. And on Saturday, we're gonna have the discussion with Kalia Kuno that we weren't able to have a couple weeks ago. So I'm very much looking forward to that. A lot of good stuff. Next Monday, I believe, if I'm correct, is the conversation with Eric Stanley and Gemma Christo about we're going to talk about dangerous San Francisco liberalism and what that actually means. And we've got Abdul Jawad Omar is going to be back next Thursday. So there's a lot of really good stuff coming up. Good to be with you. Good to see folks in the chat. Good morning. Good morning. Peace. Make sure to do the basic things and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, please. And share it, get on social media, let people know we're having this conversation. I really look forward to it today. This is our third conversation with the Good Shepherd Collective, which I'm really excited to be in conversation with these folks again. I talk with them a good bit in between our discussions, and they certainly help ground me, and very appreciative of the work that they do. If you don't know, Good Shepherd Collective is an anti-Zionist, anti-colonial organization. They work alongside their partners on the ground to openly discuss and address violent and unjust structures operating in Palestine and provide educational resources and action items to bring Palestinians closer to justice. There's a longer explanation or description in the show description. Also, check out the prior conversations we've had with them. Decolonization is not a discourse, it is a material process. And Palestine and the problem of narrative. Both of those will inform what we're going to talk about today, which is we're going to talk about the movement capture a little bit. Another way to think about in counterinsurgency. Some people prefer this term. This term actually comes a little bit more out of social movements than it does out of like the state kind of apparatus. Movement capture. It's something I've heard, Daruba Ben Wahad and others talk about over the years. And we're going to talk about that within various formations of anti-Zionist organizations, and also particularly, obviously, we're still kind of, some of us, reeling from the DNC, although fortunately it's not, I don't think, structuring our day-to-day and how we feel in the way that it did the week that it was going on. But we wanted to kind of respond to that as well. So let me welcome our guests to the stage. Bana and Laura, welcome. Good to be with you again.
Hey, Jared. Good to be with you again. Good afternoon, actually, from Dublin in Ireland. It's afternoon for me. It's probably a little bit later in the afternoon for Lara, but for those, if it's good morning for you, good morning, absolutely.
Yes.
But yeah, hello, good to be here.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us again, Jared. We're so excited to be back.
Yeah, well, I'm really thrilled always to talk to you and looking forward to this. So let's just start kind of, our previous conversations as we were talking about this, just from like a US electoral politics point of view. Biden was kind of the presumptive nominee. And obviously, he was the incumbent president. There wasn't really any kind of opposition to him, from the Democratic Party, at least. So I'm just curious a little bit in kind of starting out, like how, from your perspective, has Biden dropping out and Kamala Harris like being the nominee change the scope of what you're seeing in terms of discourse, and maybe also organizing to some degree around Palestine with regards to this election, or even, more broadly, if, it is. I know that neither of you are in the United States. And so like, I'm also asking a sort of US centric question, but we did want to talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Also, I'm just, in case folks listening don't know, I'm Palestinian American, so that kind of helps a little bit. But also in preparing for this interview, we talked with our colleagues as well, and one of our colleagues reminded us, like, okay, also don't make it too US centric, like, also be critical of the things here. But I think it's really important. I think this conversation is really important, and I think it's obvious that what happens in the US like deeply affects what happens here, right? So it's really important. You're gonna have to forgive me a little bit if I'm kind of scattered, because as we talked about before getting on, it's been a long day, a long year. So but I think it's a great question about Biden dropping out and Kamala sort of taking the position. I should say first that, like, as Good Shepherd Collective, we don't buy into electoral politics. We, are anti-imperialist, like you said. So the official position of the Good Shepherd Collective is, like, I'll say, screw the Democratic Party. We're not invested with them at all. And I know we'll talk a little bit
That's
more.
also the official position of millennials are killing capitalism, by the way. But.
I didn't doubt it for a second. I just thought I better, clarify before I go on. Yeah, but I think it had a big effect. I think Kamala Harris kind of taking the lead in this position had a lot of different effects. And one of the ones that kind of came up for me while I was thinking about my answer to this question, and I don't know if there's a better like phrasing for it, is this idea of plausible deniability. So, there had been this kind of like response to Biden that was really, I think, like, people felt clearly that he was the genocidaire in charge in the United States, that like there was no pointing the finger away from him. It couldn't be somebody else, right? And when Harris kind of took this position, all of a sudden, and still today, even to some extent, it seems like folks have this idea that even though she is literally the second person in the government, that she could somehow disagree with Biden's foreign policy, specifically around Palestine, that she could not be accountable in some way for this genocide, that she might have a totally different strategy. And I think this worked, this, like, now this is totally cognitive dissonance if somebody's still holding on to this, right? There's no kind of forgiving this position anymore now that she has literally come out and said, our position on Israel isn't going to change. Absolutely no arms embargo anytime under her presidency. But yeah, that there kind of like came out this strategy before she took office with the uncommitted movement that folks thought, that they could withhold their vote until Biden called for a ceasefire, or that, that the presidential nominee had to change, that this was kind of like an invitation to bring folks into this kind of effort that under Kamala really shifted. So I think part of it is this kind of like plausible deniability that she brought about, and to some extent seems to still be like existing. Then there's also this idea of like a symbolic win in itself, that folks got rid of Biden, even though the person who is now the nominee is again the second person in the government, but still that there's this idea that it's a symbolic win that we've gotten rid of the head genocidaire in America, in the US. But I think like the biggest part of this shift has to do with a topic that you introduced us to, that we've talked about, I think, in both of our conversations, of neoliberal identity politics, where instead of, and like please correct me at any point if I'm wrong or misrepresenting, but my understanding is like this more historic term of identity politics revolves around, you know, oppressed, marginalized groups having agency and power over their lives and the decisions in their lives and, you know, the political arrangements of their lives. Whereas neoliberal identity politics is not about substance, is not really even about agency of the people or power, but about using these elements of identity that we see, like being Black, being Palestinian, being queer, being a woman, and, you know, really using them to sustain the status quo, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, and yeah, and really mobilizes identity to do this. So I think Kamala is actually like such an excellent choice for this, because she embodies so many things that Americans are really like, you know, Americans who I think like, sorry, I should say like US Americans, who have really like, to a certain extent, it seems like adopted this idea of neoliberal identity politics as something important, as something meaningful. Not your listeners, I'm sure, but you know, maybe the majority of Americans in the liberal left spectrum. Yeah, that she really threw a wrench in this, that there is this idea of change, that she's like some kind of symbol of something other, that there are these assumptions that because she's Black and South Asian and a woman and would be the first woman president and all of these other historic wins, that it doesn't matter that, you know, she would be the leader of still a genocide, right? And still a settler state and still imperialism and all of these other things. And anyway, so I'll just end it by saying, like, I think all of these elements of her replacing Biden in this way really threw a wrench in some of the organizing that was happening against Biden, specifically with the uncommitted movement and with other folks who could be brought in under these like elements of identity and other things. And I'll hand it over to Bana.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would like to just remind people that Rifat Al-Arir, he mentioned and tweeted that tweet and saying that the Democratic Party has the blood of Palestinians in Gaza on their hands. So, you know, it was very clear for Palestinians this. You know, the problem is that it's easy, obviously, in like external to Palestine, and due to capitalism and imperialism, the nature of the world's global structure is to blame individuals for things, right? To say, well, Biden is to blame. The Democratic Party have nothing to do with it. You know, the vice president, maybe they don't have power. It's all Biden, right? The same rhetoric, obviously, is seen in like, oh, it's Netanyahu's politics. It's his policies. It's et cetera, et cetera. So all of this really has to do with this sort of, you know, categorization of crimes as, you know, and it also in law as well, within individual responsibility. So it's easy for people to say, well, there are people in the Democratic Party that aren't complicit. And then that obviously is a questionable claim. And Rifat Al-Arir was very clear when he said that the Democratic Party as a whole, if you belong to that party, you are in yourself complicit, right? So what really has changed for me, I would say, is that we've so far heard chants of Genocide Joe in the you know, on the streets, but now we hear chants calling Harris girl boss and all of these other words that they call her joy, or a lot of these things, just to make it so that, you know, she appears as sort of like from a different, you know, she's not related to that, as if like, well, Biden's politics and history and the Democratic Party history and Harris is a new thing, right? A new configuration, a new start, a new hope, right? So we see how neoliberal identity politics, as Lara plays into a relation of what she is. She's a woman and she's a person of color, and and here, woman in politics, the first potential president. This is great. This is very good for the movement, and all of these things that we've heard people say, right? But I think one of the ones that shocked me the most, the things that really, as a Palestinian, made me feel a bit disgusted was, the politics of the spectacle, as Guy Debord says it. The idea that all the posters, everything is just all made up of Harris being like this, powerful woman, really colorful posters, all of these videos of her walking and talking incoherently, of course, talking, but it doesn't matter really. She's a girl boss, right? So we can see this, how politics now is just becoming a spectacle, right? Whatever the looks, the aesthetics are there. That's all that matters. The politics, the principles, the morality, the ethics, none of that really matters. Now the problem is, and I see this as the main problem. I would call this really that the denialism of the movement so far dealing with this, right? What we had in the past, it's been a year of organizing for Palestine, is that we've seen this ceasefire movement, and I like to call it the ceasefire movement because a lot of its elements have been about calling just for a ceasefire, no more than that, and even the radical elements have been suppressed. Is that we've arrived at a stage where there's nihilism in the movement. People feel like, okay, we're not going to go anywhere, right? And this has all been led because of these different actors, including the uncommitted movement that has caused all of this mess, and obviously split the movement fairly, because the left has knows the red lines, while the so-called progressives in the Democratic Party always cross the red lines, right? So, and also, can we really call them uncommitted movement, really, because they do not really uncommit to anything. So there are certain things obviously at play here that cause this, this split between, those who call themselves the progressives, who, really what happened, really, they exposed themselves as registered clowns, really. And in Arabic, actually, we have a word for that. We don't really call clowns. We call people sahij, which is a word that means a person who really blindly and uncritically supports, people in power, and, somebody who would just clap, like literally somebody who claps for power, right? So this is the sort of, what the uncommitted progressive movement has showed us so far. And then we see the split between that and those that know the red lines, those that know that, yes, the two-party system is always going to be in service of imperialism. Electoral politics are not going to liberate the global south, etc., right? But what really is interesting is that Steven Salaita really mentions this, is that the progressives, really what they did, and with the uncommitted movement, what they did is that they showed the way. They showed the way for people joining the Democratic Party and becoming leaders of the Democratic Party, right? So if you want to become a leader, you have to audition for the role. Steven Salaita really puts it well. You have to audition for the role, right? You get accepted to that role to become basically a clown or sahij. And then you start acting in that circus, right? In the two-party system circus, right? In the electoral politics circus. So you have to do all of these things. And then you're once you're in that, you're obviously, the veneers of anti-Zionism, the veneers of, progressiveness, all of that obviously is still there, but they're veneers, right? They're not real things. So, but putting Palestine aside, right? If we're just saying, as the Good Shepherd Collective, we've always said it, supporting any Democratic Party, any candidate really at all, is always going to be in service of the US empire. So we're not, and it's willful participation. So it's not, there's no questions about it. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter whether it's Rashida Tlaib. It doesn't matter who the person is. If you belong to that party now in time, more than ever, in fact, it's very clear you know, that you're willfully participating in that, right? So you can't really wash away that truth. But one thing that like a member of the Good Shepherd Collective really always says to us, he calls it kindergarten ethics, right? They lack kindergarten ethics, these people, right? It's very simple, right? Anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism. In fact, actually, they're not very complicated. They're very simple. But what they do is that they keep conflating and they keep trying to make a sort of forced coexistence between US imperialism, right? US electoral politics, and then anti-imperialism at the same time, which is absolutely contradictory. And there's no lesser evil. I know there's people that are talking about Harris being a lesser evil. She's not a lesser evil, right? So the problem really lies here, and this is where I think we articulate the problem at the Good Shepherd Collective, is that there's no ideological, you know, coherence in large sections of the Pal Solidarity movement. Absolutely no ideological coherence. You know, you can say you're anti-Zionist, of course. You can say that, you can release a statement, but you know, you can say anything you want. Really, at the end of the day, it's about how you act and who you interact with and how you uphold, you know, anti-Zionism, right? So this is not even to mention, like, you know, the NGO like complex and their complicity. We're just talking about movement politics, and there's so much even to talk about, like movementists and movement politics and all of that. We can talk for ages about that. And in fact, one of the things that revealed to me was, you know, in fact, it was a reading that I did was by Nasser Abu Rahme in a piece called "In Tune with Their Time," right? And he talks about how Zionism exposes how in tune liberalism is with fascism, right? So we can see how the Democratic Party's so-called progressives or uncommitted movement or whoever you want to, you know, mention, all these folks have just exposed themselves really to be so in tune with US imperialism. It's obviously, you know, the people in the movement would have known this way earlier on, but it's so exposed now to the surface how in tune they are with US imperialism, how they're willing to throw Palestinians you know, out of even the equation if needed, to protect electoral politics, to create symbolic wins, right? So it's very dangerous. This, you know, development that has happened in the movement is very dangerous. It's very demoralizing, and it's shameful. Like for Palestinians, it's very shameful. How do you discuss this? How do you tell people in Gaza right now who are under genocide? Well, we have to support Harris because she is the lesser evil. Otherwise, you know, Trump will come. He will absolutely be worse. But we've seen what the Democratic Party is capable of. But also, we don't have to see what they're capable of. We just have to read history. Like, we just have to understand kindergarten ethics. We just have to understand the basics of history of US imperialism. We don't have to go further than that. So a lot happened really, and it's very shameful what happened with the uncommitted movement.
Thank you. You both said a lot. Appreciated. I think a couple things just to highlight, like the symbolic win stuff. I mean, for one, I mean, the point, I think you made this point, Lara, about the symbolic win and you know, obviously the kind of identity reductionism point. But the thing about symbolic wins is that this is a primary tool of counterinsurgency always, right? Is to give people something symbolic that they can makes them feel a certain way, right? I mean, another way to say it is psychological warfare, right? Like, you know, you make people feel a certain way, but you don't actually provide them something that is material, that has any kind of real content that you can hold on to. I think the point about spectacle and you know, I remember being in Ireland in I think 2003, And at that time, obviously Bush was our president. Everybody would grill me about whether I supported Bush, right? Because it was seen as such a horrible thing. Like the Irish people were like, "Why would you?" I was like, "No, I didn't." But the other point that they found really interesting was that as I was there, Arnold Schwarzenegger was becoming the governor of California, and they just thought that was the most insane thing that they could imagine. Like, why would you want an action hero movie actor to be the governor of like the fifth largest economy in the world? And yeah, I mean, I think about this, right? Because this is also what Trump comes out of the reality TV sphere. Like, I don't think that just the fact that he was a billionaire would have brought him into power if people didn't relate to him because of his reality TV show. You have Zelensky in Ukraine too, also an actor and I think a comedian. And and then Harris with the very performative aspects of her campaign, the I'm speaking sort of moment, right? Which I think everybody recognized that was obviously has some level of solidarity with Palestinians, how horrific that moment was. But it became a kind of meme and liberals loved it. They were like, this is, she's a powerful black woman, telling these people to be quiet while she's speaking, don't talk over her, which in another context could be an important thing, right? Because there is obviously this history, right, of women's positions being marginalized, and so it draws upon a kind of, again, like a psychological sort of resonance for people. But it's like, no, this person is running to be the most, you know, the nuclear button pusher. Like these are not, we're not talking about somebody who is like, your downtrodden coworker. And so anyways, you all touched on a lot. I think the also the comment, we're going to talk a little bit more about uncommitted. And yeah, I mean, it's a misnomer at this point. They're fully committed to Harris. They made that clear even without the concessions that they were requesting, which they even admitted were symbolic concessions. They just wanted to have a Palestinian be able to speak on the stage. The speech that was released, didn't really call for much of anything. It certainly didn't call for an arms embargo, which is the demand, I think, that probably makes a lot of sense within the confines of the Democratic Party, right? Of you could say, okay, like international law, we shouldn't be providing arms to these people, arms embargo, right? But it didn't include that. And so I mean, it's interesting in that respect because they're like, even in them being denied access to speak, what gets released as the speech that they weren't allowed to deliver is actually really bad. And so it's all of that. So anyways, I wanted to kind of shift this a little bit to some of your all critiques around what passes as anti-Zionist organizing and how broad uh that camp is, I guess you could say, or what, for lack of a better term, how broad that term can be used. I particularly wanted to talk to you two about it because it's something that you all think about a lot, you talk about a lot. You're very critical within those spaces, and I appreciate the criticism because I think we can, especially now with the benefit of hindsight of where we are in this moment, we can look back and sort of say, well, how did we get here, right? Like what were the things that were already present in terms of the contradictions within something like the ceasefire, movement. That's another point that you made that I think is really important to underscore. I mean, ceasefire as a demand was always very kind of open to a lot of interpretation and different meanings of what people meant by that. It doesn't mean Palestinian liberation. It doesn't mean reparations. It doesn't mean, anything necessarily by itself other than, people putting down weapons, basically. So anyways, I think that's mostly it. I mean, what kind of is your let's talk a little bit more about uncommitted and kind of anti-Zionist organizing and some of the critical points you would want to make in that space.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jared. I feel like I should just say, because I wanted to say this to your audience, you were talking about our critiques of anti-Zionism, and a lot of people, I think, find them really, not a lot of people. I mean, I think principled people who are aware of Palestinian history understand where those critiques come from, but I think a lot of people in the US who, if we're being honest, also make up, quite a portion of our audience, can sometimes see it as too critical. And I told you a couple of weeks ago, just, not only how important it is to like remind each other and reassure each other of our principles, but I'll say, in the hardest, like this last couple of months have been really difficult for me. And one of the most important things of like not just political organizing, but even going on to see the next day and kind of be okay, or try to be okay, or try to find hope, is listening to each other and being reassured by each other that we're not expecting a ridiculous thing of justice and dignity. And so I told you, but I want to tell your audience how important I think your podcast is, and some of the speakers that you've had on. I mean, so many of the speakers, but I can't always listen. So, I think that's really important. And I think it's really important that we reassure each other and remind each other and keep each other together. So anyway, I was thinking about that as well, because what a packed week you have for the next week of just some of the best speakers, like so exciting. I'll definitely be listening. But also, I think you asked like such an important question about how did we get here? And that, that our expectations are so low. And this thing of sort of the ceasefire campaign, for not so recently, but a few months ago, I saw folks being like, well, the call for ceasefire, yeah, we're saying ceasefire, but it means also end the occupation, end the siege. And it's like, okay, well, what do you mean when you say end the occupation? Because I know what I mean when I say end the occupation, and that means decolonization from the river to the sea, and reparations, and dismantling the Israeli state and all of the things that go along with it, and all of the institutions that have supported it and Zionism for more than a century. And I think most people, when they're, sitting in the halls of Congress or whatever and saying ceasefire now, I don't think that that's necessarily everything that they're thinking about, especially if they're not studying and aligned with the Palestinian historical practice and knowledge of what is, dismantling Zionism, disrupting it, resisting it. And I think those are really important conversations to have. I know, like, we'll talk more about that in a little bit, so I'll get to the uncommitted bit. But I think that is a big part of what's brought us to this moment, is not having those difficult conversations, not being sure that we're aligned on principles and accountability and mechanisms that maintain these principles in all of the things that we do, and also allow us to have open and honest conversations with each other in good faith. I mean, I think that's a really important element of this. And that also relates to the uncommitted movement, right? Because with the uncommitted movement, you had, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, at least tens of thousands of people who were voting because they had something that they wanted to say. And they wanted to exercise their power in a way that refused to participate in re-electing Biden, in supporting this campaign of genocide, and probably, other elements of his genocidal, colonial, capital, imperial, reign as well. And I think that's really important. I was talking with one of my friends today who is here, but is, was a voter early on in the uncommitted movement, sort of like in Michigan, and talking about how, yeah, this was like an active agency, right? And so the things that the folks representing the uncommitted movement did at the DNC wasn't just like a huge waste of power and a huge waste of potential, and like an intentional one, right? It wasn't a mistake that they did that. it was also a betrayal. And not just the betrayal of the people being mass murdered here and being colonized and being kicked out of their homes and imprisoned, but also the people in the US who said, okay, maybe I wouldn't have voted at all. And, I'm going to participate because I see value in leveraging my power in this way. So I think that's a huge thing. But I want to talk a lot about, or a little bit more about, the wasted potential of this power, because they had something like 30 delegates, right? And the name is uncommitted. This is the moment to make a stand, right? And do something. And for weeks before as well, we had folks saying there's going to be thousands of people demonstrating outside. We know that there were people there, right? Getting beaten up by the cops, getting arrested. And what the uncommitted movement at the very least was asking for, right, was a ceasefire in exchange for maybe the possibility of voting. And that's not a wild ask. Like, we know it could happen tomorrow if Biden said it, or if Kamala said it, or whatever. At this point, Biden. And instead, what they did was, like you said, they gave up all of this power, all of this opportunity to make a very public stand in this moment in order to capitulate to power and really like betray and sacrifice people. And I think it's worth taking a moment to think, well, what would have happened if they used this pressure? Like, what would really have happened if those 30 delegates went and they said, no, we're not going to vote for Harris? And I was thinking about it, and personally, I don't actually know like the specific system of how delegates work. And if you're uncommitted, like, should they have even voted for Harris? To me, that seems undemocratic in principle if they're uncommitted. But to endorse Harris, right? That, like, what would have happened if they didn't? I mean, I think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'll just say quickly to that. I don't mean to cut you off, but because I know you're going somewhere else with that, but materially, probably not anything, because they had enough delegates. They didn't actually need them at that point. But also, I think if you're already looking for symbolic, or even something that has some kind of movement energy to it, it would seem that remaining uncommitted, right, would be uh, at least make some kind of scene. It would at least be something people had to talk about, yeah, anyways, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah.
No, you're totally right. I was going to say, would you even call it pragmatic? Since that's part of our discussion, right? I mean, to me, yeah, it seems like unstrategic entirely to say, here's all the power in our hands, and here you can have it. What a ridiculous thing to do. I mean, I think it's totally unstrategic. I hate the word pragmatic, but in this case, it doesn't seem pragmatic either. So I think that's really, I think it's really important to think about that, because like you said, materially, probably nothing would have happened. But doesn't that give us more reason that they should have done something? Harris wasn't counting on their delegates. If in the end they still wanted to vote for her, by all means, if that's what they need to do. But if that's the case, then it makes this sacrifice and this betrayal all the more meaningful, because it shows even when it means nothing, even when we gain nothing from it, except as individuals, and we'll get to that, we are still willing to sell you out. The people who are dying, the people who are fighting, the people who are on hunger strike, the people who are being tortured and murdered in jail, the people who are losing their scholarships, their access to education, their jobs, maybe their careers. We're willing to sacrifice all of you to the altar of not even electoralism, because she didn't even get elected in a primary. So the altar of whatever this is, US politics. And I think that's really important for folks to wrap their minds around. I think there's other things I wanted to bring up, like what changed for them, why would they even think Harris was going to give them what they want? She made it very clear they couldn't even have a speech. And I think it kind of, we can talk about what Banna brought up about how electoral politics is theatrics, and that especially this convention was really, theatrical. I mean, to talk about joy in a time of genocide, that alone can tell you, yeah, they probably were never going to allow Palestinians on the stage, because how can you have a convention about joy when somebody's on the stage, asking you to stop murdering their relatives? I think that would be really difficult to keep the theme up. But in addition to waste of power, I mean, I think this gets to the theme of counterinsurgency that we were talking about, that, you have folks who have been for months now organizing around this genocide, folks who were willing to participate in this, kind of movement in order to try to wrest some power back from the democratic machine. And yeah, and that these folks just took all of that power, sold out folks in the US and folks here in Palestine and folks elsewhere. But it also kind of has revealed, I think, like even beyond the uncommitted movement, how progressives in the in the Democratic Party, like who maybe supported the uncommitted movement or not, really like can no longer even position themselves as outside of the Democratic Party or agitating within the Democratic Party, because when it came down to it, they fell in line, just as the folks in the, uncommitted movement did. And again, for what, right? For themselves. Like, I think we can talk about, you sent us a great article, and I don't know if we can share it with the folks here, that named Palestinian Americans who were part of at least leading the uncommitted movement in the space of the DNC. James Zogby is one of them. And what does it mean to like sell out all these folks who are voting, if not the folks in Gaza? I mean, I think very clearly it's like a cynical part of ingratiating yourself to the genocidal Democratic Party. And we see that in lots of different ways. We've seen that with AOC, and we've seen that with other actors as well. And even in the speech that they finally released, they didn't call it a genocide. They didn't call for an arms embargo. I mean, like you said, what would have been the value of giving that speech? Do we need a Palestinian on the platform of the genocidal party that's literally funding and carrying out this genocide? I think that's it for me. I just wanted to say one last thing, which is like maybe important for folks to remember. And one of our colleagues reminded me of this as well before we got on the call, that I think it was back in October or November that folks from Rifat, I'm sure, to us and many, 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 many others were online saying, hey, it's October, it's November, it's December, it's an electoral year. Tell your representatives, from Biden to your local representative, that you're not going to vote for them unless they call for a ceasefire. Tell them now. And there were petitions, and I know because we helped facilitate that, not only in the US, also in Canada, also elsewhere, for folks to tell their politicians from as early as October, November, that they weren't going to vote for them unless they supported ending this genocide. So even the idea itself, right? It when I was reminded of that, it kind of put a new lens on it, because it's also not that the uncommitted movement offered something new, right? It was sort of the reorganization of something that was already happening into a movement, which was then co-opted and sold out. So I think that kind of sheds like a different light and gives a different perspective on the way that counterinsurgency works, that, this call was happening for a long time before we got to the DNC a few weeks ago, and really was like stolen from folks who were calling from it as early as the genocide began. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one thing on this really, is that like the symbolic win bit actually was quite concerning. I had to dwell on this on this. What does the symbolic win mean in and during a genocide, right? So there's a saying in Palestine really that says those with their hands in cold water and those with their hands in fire, which basically means there are two different people that may basically have one, they can basically decide things without having any issue because their hands are in cold water, and people whose urgency to get out of that fire because their hands in the fire is basically, calling for people basically that, well, you can't really ask us to hold on anymore. You cannot really ask us to be resilient anymore or tolerate the fire anymore because your hand is in the cold water, my hand is in the fire. It's too different to you. So this is what it is. It felt like their hands are in cold water. They know Palestinian hands are in the fire, really, but they can easily decide, well, we can have symbolic win. But how is the symbolic win really going to be helpful in this case? Of course, it's not helpful, but what it is actually, in fact, is harmful, really, because what ends up happening is you demoralize people, right? You're not reaching any material change. You're not really getting any real material win. People have been on the street for almost a year and nothing has really happened, right? So the question is that, well, if our ceiling of our demands keep lowering and lowering during a genocide and the continuation of a genocide, then how do we expect that a symbolic win, that Palestinians basically in Gaza should be celebrating a symbolic win, or anybody should be celebrating a symbolic win? In fact, actually, we should be opposed to symbolic wins. Like, who are we kidding? We're almost a year into that genocide, and symbolic win, like we not even the high ceiling is enough at this stage, like, if you ask me and if you ask Palestinians, right? But you can see how, like, the strategy, of course, to win the race and to win the electoral race has become the priority of the uncommitted movement again, right? We lost all of this sort of rhetoric of, yeah, we need to do this. This is a strategy to push them, or let's push them to what we want. Let's build people power, and all of these words that we kept hearing that obviously were hollow, right? So the thing about, like, speaking as well, just to add something to that, I think when Edward Said really mentioned the permission to narrate, he never said that, well, because we don't have the permission to narrate our history as Palestinians and our narrative and our stories as Palestinians, is that we should seek inclusion in those spaces and hold and ask for platforms for the inclusion of our narratives. No, he meant to speak despite them. So the idea is that, like, that people should, clap for the fact that, oh yes, some Zionists said that they were unhappy that Palestinians were not given a platform. They felt, well, if Zionists are given a platform, Palestinians should too. So should we clap for that? Should we be clapping for this? Should we be happy that, Zionists are saying that we should be included? These are the limits and the banality of liberalism, is that inclusion is all it could go for. That's it. That's the limit. That's the reach that you can reach. Inclusion. Anything else, about liberation, about US imperialism out of Palestine, out of the global South, out of Sudan, no, none of that. It's just inclusion. To be able to speak, and not even to speak your truth, but to be speaking even a toned down truth, right? A policed truth, right? So what bothers me the most is not just the begging to be part of a platform that is very shameful and humiliating as a Palestinian, but those people that just believe that we need to constantly be included, that inclusion is important. But the system that you want us to be included in is the same system that was built on our exclusion. So it's just paradoxical, really. So it's an embarrassment for Palestinians. It's a humiliation for Palestinians to be sitting down and crying like clowns and saying, oh my God, we're not given space to speak. And look, I didn't really actually want to mention this, but I really like this this sort of concept created, even though he's obviously the theorist on nihilism, but Nietzsche really writes very well on slave morality. And you know what he says about slave morality? He says it's a type of mentality that you have, that you start sort of, in the oppressed really start glorifying their oppression, and they fetishize their oppression because they believe they have the highest morality, the highest moral ground for being oppressed, right? So instead of actually breaking the shackles of oppression, you start accepting and normalizing oppression, right? So that's the slave morality, right? The idea is that you don't want to come at the master and be like, you know, let's get rid of you. We no longer want to have that relationship of master and slave. No, let's just fetishize our oppression. Let's fetishize our situation and move no further than that. And look, Frantz Fanon, even in Black Skin and White Masks, talked about similar concepts of inclusion in the oppressive polity, right? He wrote a whole book about it, you know, and in the Wretched of the Earth also it's mentioned. So these concepts are not new. Like, we know this idea of wanting to be included in violent systems, to have the right to speak, but it's not even the right to speak with agency, as Lara mentioned. It's about being there. Like, it's hollow, it's shameful, it's humiliating. So, and this mindset is really not accidental, by the way, in the Democratic Party, in the progressives. This mindset, this sort of fetishization, this all of that stuff of, you know, between Rashida Tlaib and all of this. And I'm very, very, very vocal about these things. They don't see themselves as part of the problem. They see themselves external to the problem. And this is because they have this sort of idea, right? And so Palestinians are not really voting for inclusion. Like, imagine saying the same thing, like, oh yeah, we're very upset that we were not able to have a platform along with Zionists and at the DNC. So you go and tell the mother and the parent of a martyr, you should support us because it's a horrible day. We were not able to have a platform. Like, it's just banal and it's shameful. Like, inclusion in that system is betrayal. It is in fact counterinsurgency as well, like as you said. So it's all of these things about just how the oppressed really see themselves within systems that are violent, and seeking inclusion in those systems really just puts a question mark, puts an exclamation mark there even. So how are we meant to keep watching those theatrics, right? And Julia Qasim's article in Al Mayadeen also talking about the uncommitted movement actually put it very well as well. It's all theatrics, really. It's all, and you're supposed to engage in that. And once you walk out from that and you look externally, you realize that everybody is a clown, really. Everybody in that space is a clown, and this is a circus, and you are witnessing genocide, and what's your response to it is some form of fetishization of symbolic wins and of your own oppressive status, and no move to remove that oppressive status, or really work to even do the minimum, which is end the genocide, really stopping the genocide. Even a ceasefire, which has become more or less an empty word, as some say.
I appreciate everything you all had to say, for sure. Just for folks who are wondering, I will pull it up for just a second. I put it in the chat. But the article that you both referenced briefly, is this piece in Al Mayadeen: the uncommitted movement is uncommitted to resistance, committed to the establishment. It's a good piece, you know, it goes into some of the individuals, some of the PACs and the kind of funding, you know, who these things are connected to, the DSA's role, so on and so forth. And so I definitely encourage people to read that piece for themselves too. It does a good job of kind of laying out, you know, some of what we saw, explaining it. I'll say for myself, just to in full transparency, like I did vote uncommitted in the primaries, and I did also sign the thing that you all had sent out and sent it to my electeds, prior to that. Um, and I thought that was, I mean, I don't put very much weight at all in terms of these voting processes or what we do during them, and I don't really think that, as people know who've listened to me over the years, I don't really think that that's much of how we do politics. And I think it's a big problem how much people think of it as the way to do politics is just to vote, right? And that's sort of the only thing that they need to do. They've done their civic responsibility or whatever. But I also knew that if it came to a convention, especially the only opportunity I really saw that the uncommitted movement might play some kind of role is if they had an open convention. So if after Biden dropped out, they hadn't rallied around Kamala, right, and had gone to a convention where the delegates actually got to vote and decide on who the candidate for the Democratic Party would be, then 30 delegates is still not a lot, but maybe they could have played a little bit of a role negotiating, on policy or the platform, that maybe would have done something. I don't have a lot of faith in that either, but I agree with you both in terms of for the movement to have represented itself in some kind of principled fashion through this process, it would have had to have had some kind of clear red line of, look, you may not need our support, but we're also not giving it unless A, B, and C happen. And, again, that would be even if the DNC said no thank you, which they probably would have, at least then you stood on principle of not, putting your support behind, uh, you know, Kamala Harris at this point. But ultimately, these people are all, and this is the point you're making, is that, and it's the uncommitted, it's discussed in the article about, these are people who are, a delegate typically is a person who is a politician and who has a role within the Democratic Party. And so even if they were uncomfortable with genocide and sort of became representatives for the uncommitted movement, ultimately it's kind of an inside thing. And, the likelihood would be that they would betray the people. The big betrayal is between the people who were voting uncommitted, because the people who were voting uncommitted obviously were doing so as an objection to the policy of the genocide, right? Um, so, anyways, I just wanted to say some of that. All right. So next up, um, and the other thing too, you mentioned this too about the lack of democracy within the process. I mean, that other people have spoken about this. We haven't talked about it too much here, but really, the Democratic Party and the ruling class performed a coup within the Democratic Party. They knew that Biden had lost so much, both because of his age, but also because of how um, unpopular, right, he was, and a lot of that having to do with the genocide and his being very directly the person responsible. That again, I think, Laura, this point that you made earlier about plausible deniability, even though it's not plausible, really, because if Harris had a different position, she's free to say it, and she's saying the exact same position that Biden has been saying for months and months now. But that still creates this kind of buffer, and layer where people say, well, maybe she's a little different. Maybe we can encourage her differently or whatever. So I want to go to the kind of anti-Zionist part of the discussion, because there's this piece on your website you have that's co-created, as I understand, with M. Cohen. That's kind of it's about anti-Zionist allyship, and I think my only real, I don't want to be critical, but I'll just say, like, I think we're at a point where Palestinians probably need more than allies, right? And they need people who are really comrades and really see the struggle, really, as you have all said, like study and understand the struggle of Palestinian liberation, and are there to not only be a kind of front for that struggle, but also to understand that struggle is connected to so many other things, right? Including our own, freedom and liberation ultimately in the final instance, I think. And um, but there's some really good points that are made in the piece. And one of the things that is written there is, quote, part of developing real anti-Zionist politics is developing a keen eye for politics that seem anti-Zionist, but in fact represent the interests of Zionists. And I think this was part of the conversation that I definitely wanted to have. It reminds me of Stephen Salaita saying that, he can just sort of smell the Zionism on certain folks, or in certain instances, whether it's an organization or an individual. Like, he's like, Palestinians just have a sense. We can just sort of tell. But I appreciate that you all have spent some time and thinking, like trying to help identify these things a little bit and see where they come from, like materially. And so, we've already discussed a little bit about how to actually orient ourselves towards the struggles and demands of those oppressed by Zionism in some of our prior conversations. But honestly, I wonder if we could revisit some of these politics that, seem anti-Zionist, but in fact represent the interests of Zionism.
Yeah, I think like it's very important to mention that we originally like hoped that, or we had like sort of hope that this movement was carried by the principle of anti-Zionism. And if unfortunately what we've seen is that it had the veneer of anti-Zionism, but it actually didn't. One thing that we tell folks about all the time is that anti-Zionism like is actually not very difficult to understand. It's not as complicated. It's very simple. So it's not to say that like, oh well, what is like how is this Zionist and how is not Zionist? And it's in fact, very simple. And we've explained that through our article on a magazine a little bit, and we have an upcoming piece as well that discusses anti-Zionism more thoughtfully and critically. But one of the things that people don't understand about Zionism and anti-Zionism is that we've seen like NGOs and movements and different groups sort of use the language of anti-Zionism, even though their language more so fits into the non-Zionism category, which is, we've seen actually people even define themselves as non-Zionists, right? Just imagine yourself really calling yourself, I'm a non-racist, right? Saying I'm not anti-racist, but I'm a non-racist. As in, I might not really engage in racism, but I am also like not going to actively fight racism. Like I'm not going to like really participate in that movement. So even that is quite interesting. So we've seen people define themselves as that. Obviously, like the Zionism is easy to pick up on. The problem is that we have a lot of people that tell us, oh well, this organization called themselves anti-Zionist, so are they anti-Zionist? Well, it's very easy to look at their liberal Zionism. Like we have a lot of organizations that would engage in liberal Zionism and would engage in Zionism and obviously call themselves anti-Zionist. So an indicator, and I say a huge indicator and usually forgotten, is the normalization indicator, right? Both sidism indicator, right? We've seen since the beginning of the genocide, we've seen people in statements, we've seen people how they speak about Palestine, how they speak about, quote unquote violence and all of that, about, condemning all violence, about how they, call it war instead of genocide and all of that. And they might at once, of course, say things like, oh yeah, we are anti-Zionist, as in like, they define it as being anti like Israeli government currently, so the system and the government right now, and is they're opposed to it, but they don't prescribe themselves as, we are, anti-Zionist in the sense of Zionism as a settler colonial ideology of ethnic cleansing and, you know, apartheid and, you know, capitalism and all of that. They don't understand that history. They just see it as some sort of something that happened in the past and then unfortunately happened. They would still mention it, like they would still mention the Nakba, they would still mention it. But then now Israel is there, but it's there, right? It's there, it's a fact. And they will have some policies that are bad, and we're opposed to those policies, but we're not opposed to the end of that state. We're not opposed to the dismantlement of that state. We're not supporting the dismantlement of that state. We're opposed to, in fact, having, you know, a liberated Palestine from the river to the sea. We see, you know, things like solutions. We see things in like the words of two-state solution, one-state solution. We don't see beyond that. We don't see the language of liberation. We don't see the language of decolonization. That is what those people that call themselves anti-Zionists, but actually in fact hold and uphold liberal Zionism. And so one of the things that I keep asking folks, like, how do you determine that this organization is anti-Zionist if they actually have really radical politics, but they still engage with the liberal Zionists? And this is the question. This is the basic, like, very, very small equation. If you are an organization and you engage and uphold space for liberal Zionist talking points, you are facilitating Zionism, right? If you are allowing people to demonize Palestinian armed resistance, the acts of resistance in front of your face, while you are supportive of them because of the sort of liberal tolerance of views, you are upholding and advancing Zionism. And lastly, anybody speaking about life after Gaza, and we've seen this, by the way, in a piece that was published, Life After Gaza, what happens after Gaza? And those people that speak about like the genocide as if some sort of past or like what happens post the genocide are upholding Zionism, because what they're doing is, instead of actively acting to stop the genocide, they're seeing it as like some sort of, like, you know, de facto thing that happened. It's a fact. We can't do anything about it. And it's also engaging in defeatist, nihilistic politics, right? And why I keep saying nihilistic politics is because they've conditioned themselves, these sort of liberal Zionists, in that, like, okay, we are only going to accept as far as what we, you know, what like we can have, which is a pragmatist approach. And what we can have is a, you know, well, previously was a two-state solution, but now it's some form of coexistence and peace, and there's the language have become, you know, more or so vague these days, because people are realizing that the executioner and the victim cannot coexist together, but the language is still there. Like, one of the things that we point out at the Good Shepherd Collective is that we have, like, it's easy for us to look at statements and see, look, if you're in your statement, you're condemning October 7th. That's a big saying about what you hold, like what kind of principle you hold, whether it's non-Zionism or liberal Zionism, right? So it's easy to point these things out. The problem is that we see the movement of Palestine solidarity movement abroad, not just in the US, by the way. We're talking everywhere, right? There's the ones that are defining themselves with anti-Zionism are not really aware of what it actually means. And then there are a large portion that are not even defining themselves with that language. Why? Because they still see things as like, well, this is a policy issue, or this is a war, this is a matter of the current situation. So they would obviously call for a ceasefire, but they wouldn't have them say, well, the troops need to be out of Gaza, or like, Palestine needs to be liberated fully. And they wouldn't be citing like things like, well, because the international law says this and that. No, I mean, Palestinians, at the end of the day, we cite obviously, international law because it's been a tool after Oslo. Or maybe even, I don't even want to go towards the point of it being counterinsurgency as well, or counterinsurgent in a way, but we use that language because, but it has been limiting as well. So if somebody asks you and says, well, under international law, the occupied territories include Gaza, so that's why we believe Gaza needs to be removed from the occupiers, that's Zionism. So anything that tolerates the existence of Israel on the land of Palestine is Zionism. So it's not about policy, it's also about like material, and territory is very important. I mean, Frantz Fanon talks about it, land, territory. It's what the oppressed really, they've died for, really. The colonized die for their land, and so they can't exclude that from the equation, right? But at the end of the day, you can go on and read, articles about what anti-Zionism is, and you can read statements, even the DSA, what they had some sort of statement saying that they are anti-Zionist, but you can see how some, elements of the DSA, I mean, we're not talking about the people, we're talking about DSA as institution. They see themselves as capable easily of holding, non-Zionists. Let's not call it liberal Zionism, because, the DSA supporters will be like, no, we're not Zionists. But they do hold non-Zionist views. They're not anti-Zionist. I wouldn't call them so. So it's just, we have to be clear that statements don't matter, because at the end of the day, what happened with the DSA is that they sidelined and the conversation, and they joined hands in hands with the uncommitted movement and sabotaged the potential. At least there was some potential, regardless of our position on the Democratic Party. There was some potential to push something in terms of like if they actually reached for Harris as well and been like, well, it doesn't matter who changed and what changed. You are still complicit, and we're not going to stop until you give us a ceasefire. There could have been a potential there. So you have to look at actions of these groups. You have to look at their politics and how they act, and their statements. Some of the statements are also just relatively clear. Like they just say it up front. They would say things like, well, we think that Israelis and Palestinians can live peacefully together. And I say, in behalf of Palestinians, at the end of the day, it's as if telling, and I'm sorry to mention this if it's a trigger warning, but saying like a rapist and a victim can live together. It's similar to that. It's very, very, it's asking Palestinians to do that, and you can see the limits of liberalism in that, they would probably hear that conversation, they would hear that example, and they would still think, well, this is the only way. Like, this is the only way that you can have peace, quote unquote. And also, anybody that speaks of peace during genocide is Zionist, by the way. This is an important element. So normalization, peace talks during that, with people who talk about the life after Gaza, and the people who engage in both sidism, those are people that are not, and absolutely not, anti-Zionists. They will not, even if they claim to support Palestine, even if they uplift Palestinian voices, even if they do everything for Palestine, if they do that, if they say those things, they're not going to be for the emancipation of the oppressed Palestinians.
Bana, I was sitting here clapping and snapping to myself while I'm on mute. That was so good. Maybe I'll just add a little bit, like a couple of examples that we discussed that relate to some of the things Bana brought up already. I mean, I think also you mentioned it, Jared, that like there's been a lot of kind of like obfuscation and confusion, and that's around these terms, right, around Zionism, anti-Zionism, with ceasefire, so that the term like literally has lost its meaning at this point, where you have the US saying Hamas won't accept a ceasefire, and the ceasefire in question is like a 4-week pause and the military stays in Gaza, and after 4 weeks the genocide continues. So there's been like a complete erosion of meaning in words by a variety of actors. And part of why I think your critique also of the or like critical perspective, let's say, of the guide that we made with M. Cohen, and I really have to say, like, I'm a big fan of M. Cohen. We're big M. Cohen fans. She did a lot in that.
I am too, by the way. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, not trying to imply that you're not.
No,
Yeah.
no. I just want to say, like, yeah, that, like, yeah. I'm not taking
Yeah.
shots at M or you all.
Oh yeah, no, I didn't feel like you were. I just wanted to say because M really put a lot of work into that. And we really appreciated that. That was a big deal. I think like it was really an attempt to like have a first stab at what such a violent term, but have a first attempt at what, could be like a guide, because it doesn't seem like any of these guides exist already meaningfully, and there's not like a set of institutional principles at any organization that I know of that uses that term to describe themselves. So this was like sort of the first attempt, but I think it's a really important comment that you mentioned, that Palestinians really deserve more. And that's been and not just Palestinians, right? Like so many groups of people really deserve more. And I think this like cross context kind of solidarity that's rooted in history, that's rooted in knowledge and like real resistance, I think it's been a project that people have been trying to build up, right? I mean, for a long time. Like there are lots of historical examples, but even in my own life over the last 10 years, I've seen it. But you also see how like a lot of times that gets co-opted into neoliberal identity politics and electoralism. And so that's been a real challenge. And I think that's why when we had this idea and in the subsequent things that we wrote, we really try to like give people action items, because oftentimes we do get lost in these like terms and people don't understand or don't read, or and it can be overwhelming as well to read and find out who you should be reading. So anyway, but I think that's a really good point. I also wanted to say, like, I thought I love this idea of the smell test. I laughed, and I love it when Stephen said like he can just smell it on some people. And I think that for a lot of Palestinians, especially Palestinians who have kind of grown up like with this history, with their family telling them, living it, that's true. And at the same time, it seems that there are a lot of people who don't know the difference, right? Because part of why we wrote it as well is that this like we talked a lot in the first interview that we did with you about neoliberal identity politics and the ways that Palestinian identity is a lot of times co-opted into advancing Zionism, right? And like a lot of times that's in the normalization projects that Bana mentioned, but sometimes it's in like more like still normalization, but maybe more discrete acts of normalization, where you have organizations that maybe even refer to themselves as anti-Zionist or don't make an official stance and kind of make critiques of Netanyahu and hope you will assume they're anti-Zionist. And they'll put Palestinians in the forefront and say, here's our Palestinian, here, they agree with us, so how come you don't? And that's really problematic. So for Palestinians who maybe know some of these things but don't have them written down, or maybe don't know them at all, it's also important, right? So yeah, so just like I just wanted to kind of say that because it came up for me as you were talking about it. And I think also there is this assumption like sometimes that we all can see things, and like that Palestinians, even those situated in history, see the same things. And it doesn't seem to me like the more time that I look and I listen, it seems that that's not always the case. So like this is part of the good faith discussion, right? But yeah, so anyway, I think there are these like declarations a lot lately, right? As anti-Zionism like comes more into the mainstream and people see the material effects of Zionism and see very clearly what Zionism has done for more than a century now. There are these like declarations of anti-Zionism. And this was something that one of our colleagues brought up that I wanted to add in here because I thought it's so funny, so interesting, and really I'm sure will land for anyone who's in the US, maybe also, in Europe. Like we all know someone who has said to us, I'm not a racist, right? We all know someone who's done that. And when somebody says that to you, what's your first thought?
You're a racist.
Right. So what does it mean? Like, right, if our largest contribution to like thought of anti-Zionism or Zionism is that we're not that, and we never go further than those kind of claims, like materially or even rhetorically, it should raise flags. And there are people doing this, and we're going to talk about them more, but I'll just say for now, like JVP is one of these groups that has been doing this continually, at least over the last year, I think before, because they made a declaration a few years ago. And you can look at their definition of anti-Zionism, and you can look at our article, to compare and contrast. We actually reference theirs and talk about it a little bit. But, this is important because just saying that you're not something doesn't make you not something. And anyone who has suspicions probably rightfully has them, right? Especially if you never go further in your discussion. And so it's really like what Bana said, how you act, how you react, how you uplift some analysis, how you incorporate that analysis into your behavior, how you suppress others. And we'll talk more about suppression in the counterinsurgency in a bit. But that's really important. And I think people really focus a lot, like we talk about neoliberal identity politics and kind of like the theatrics and the visuals, that rhetoric can also play a big part in that. And that's really important. There's another thing about kindergarten ethics. I think Bana already brought it up a little bit, but I think it's important that, there's this idea that people talk about like more now with this kind of vagueness of language that we'll have coexistence, equality for all, and nobody says what that's going to look like, how we're going to get there, what it means. But like we wrote about this in the piece, but I think it's always worth bringing up again that, okay, in kindergarten, if you steal another kid's toy, justice isn't that you keep the toy and then, or even that you share it necessarily if it's their toy. Justice is going to be the teacher gives the toy back, and maybe there's a discussion about why we don't steal others' things, and we can ask to share them. And so I think like this is a basic thing. And when people make these kinds of vague declarations, it's not just that they're obfuscating the conversation and meaning and words and history and visions of the future, but it's also that they're trying to ensure that the settlers remain, and that they keep their privileges, and that they have a seat at the table, right? Because if you say equal rights for all, and you don't address that the settlers' rights literally come at the expense of the colonized, in the sense that the land is stolen, the water is stolen, the roads are stolen, the resources are stolen, self-determination is stolen, all of those are taken from someone else. If you don't address that, it means you're forgetting it, or you're, requesting that it be forgotten. And so that's really important. That's like not something we would even teach our children. So why would we take seriously someone who says, I'm not a racist, and then pretends that it's not worth discussing that your right to self-determination has been stolen for 100 years. And then there are other ways that this happens, that this kind of like anti-Zionist, like Zionism as anti-Zionism happens on a more personal level that can have like larger effects. And this is a conversation that's kind of been going on for months, but that we brought up yesterday online. There's a book that came out yesterday by, what's her name? Alyssa Wise, who's a rabbi, and Rebecca Vilkomerson. I don't know if that's how you pronounce her name, but that's how I say it in my head. And it came out, I believe, originally it was supposed to come out the day before Nakba Day, which is quite grim. And there was some pushback because they're publishing during a time of genocide about solidarity. And for some background, I don't know Alyssa Wise as well. She's connected to Rabbis for Ceasefire, which has sort of done some actions, some of which seem to be quite symbolic, and I don't know that much else. But Rebecca Vilkomerson used to be the head of JVP, I think, before they ever made a like even nominal rhetorical commitment to anti-Zionism. And part of her like ousting, from what I understand from JVP, related to the fact that her husband is Israeli and works for a company, something like Checkpoint Security or Checkpoint Surveillance or something. It's a company that engages in surveillance or supports surveillance by infrastructure that's used against Palestinians in the West Bank, if not in Palestine in general. And so, to the best of my knowledge, JVP has never contended with this or discussed how one of its founders, one of its former leaders, has been married to someone who is part of this and made money, right? And made a name and became a quote unquote expert on Palestine while being married to a person engaged in this and profiting monetarily and not disclosing it either. But these are the two people who published the book. And what we have been trying to point out to people is that publishing a book like this isn't just about the money. Now, yesterday when the book came out, they said, well, all the profits are going to We're Not Numbers, and that's great. We're Not Numbers, deserves the money, and also so do many, many, many other Palestinian organizations and individuals in Gaza. None of which, by the way, have been uplifted by either authors during the genocide, as far as I know, until yesterday. But nobody writes a book, and you can ask academics, I'm sure nobody writes a book for the profit, right? Nobody writes a book for the profit they're going to make off of the book. People write books to be seen as experts on that subject, to be invited to speak and to be influential. I mean, sure, to share their knowledge, but in this case, it's to be situated as experts. And so what does it mean for two people who haven't materially, haven't materially contributed to Palestinian solidarity, like who don't even seem to have read Palestinian history? Like, what does it mean to Palestinians to resist Zionism? To be situating themselves as experts during a time of genocide. People who aren't even calling for others to donate to the GoFundMes of families trying to get their children medical care or get their families out of the space of genocide, I mean, I think this is really something we have to contend with. And I hope I'm not giving the book too much free press, because I don't think it would have been incredibly popular anyway. But I think that folks really need to think about this, because there are actors right now who could be saying it is not only is it not an appropriate time, you're not an appropriate author to be writing about this subject. I mean, to call what you have been doing an act of revolutionary love while people are engaged in real revolutionary behavior in Palestine right now, right? That we can see, and elsewhere in the world, that we can see very clearly that you're not participating in or supporting and have condemned. What do we do with that? Sorry, my cats are fighting in the background here. But so they're getting mad, they're getting heated about this topic as well. Anyway, I think these are really important things, and it's not just for individuals or organizations. And like, at the end of the day, like, there's another part of this, that do Palestinians need to be the ones calling this out every time it happens? Right? Like, what about the anti-Zionist allies in the US? What about like Jewish Voice for Peace? Like I said, never contended with Phil Commerson's husband, her connection to these things. As far as I know, I could be wrong. I would be happy to be corrected. But where are they, right? Saying, hey, wait, this is weird. This is wild. Why are you writing this book? Why are you publishing this book now? Anyway, like, I've spent a long time on this book, so I just want to give another example, but and it'll be about another book, but I'll make it quicker, which is there's another author, another Jewish American, who I think maybe at one point would have, or called himself non-Zionist, post-Zionist. Now I think he probably just goes by Zionist, Joshua Leifer, who published a book about Jewish American, like the Jewish American community today and history. There was an event that he was supposed to give, I think in Brooklyn or somewhere. And I don't know if the event was canceled or if the bookstore refused to host the person who would have been his like interlocutor, who was a rabbi, who is a Zionist. I mean, you can look him up. I won't give his name because I honestly don't remember it, but you can look it up. it was a big deal. So either way, whether the bookstore, just disinvited this person, they disinvited him because they said, we won't host a Zionist. That's what they said. And now, of all times, this is like a great statement, a very brave and bold, thing, a great stance to take. Anyway, they took the stance, the event was canceled, and since then, the manager who took that stance has been fined as a result of the pressure that was created by Joshua Leifer and the other people, in his orbit, Peter Beinhardt, I'm sure all of the other folks who were probably looking forward to going to that event and talking about these things. And the point isn't just about, the material consequences, the attacks on people who are actually taking a stance against Zionism, but this is part of like a history, like a recent history, right? Joshua Leifer, in the days after October 7th, published a critique of the left, talking about how the left isn't humanistic enough for celebrating Palestinians breaking out of the, concentration camp of Gaza. And that, he couldn't celebrate or be part of a left that would harm the people that he cares about here, the settlers that he cares about here. And while I think we can all understand like this kind of emotional thing of we don't like to see people get hurt, right? That's like a human thing. But this isn't really about that, right? Like trying to critique people for not being human enough for celebrating that, people living in a concentration camp continue to resist, or refusing to condemn them for resisting. That's not about humanism, right? And this is another way, like, we advance Zionism while completely obfuscating what the problem is. That we should all feel good about ourselves, that Palestinians should be happy victims, that we should die quietly, rather than resist. And also that these people will only support us as long as we resist within the confines of what they accept, right? And it's not just Joshua Leifer, who I believe now just openly identifies as a Zionist. It's also people who call themselves anti-Zionist and insist on that every day as well. And this is something that we need to like think about and contend with in our actions, because again, with this person, it's not just about the person, it's about all of the institutions that platform this person, that platform those around them, that give them a space to be seen as like an expert, as a thinker, as someone who has a real understanding of history that's respectable and, deserves consideration. Yeah. And so I think that, let me see, I'm just looking at my notes to see if there's anything else that I want to talk about. I mean, I think it's just important that we think about these things, about what is anti-Zionism and what's not, because as we talked about at the beginning of this question, when I started a while ago, that, this is all obfuscation, right? This is all obfuscation. This is all in service of maintaining something that's violent. And the people who can't participate in this discussion right now, the people who can't tell us what Zionism is, are the people who are under the rubble, or the people who are dying resisting it, or the people who are just dying trying to get bread for their families in line, or trying to organize to get out of Gaza right now. So I think that's really important, because these conversations and these, ambiguities aren't just things out in the ether that we can discuss, into oblivion. They're things that right now are changing or ending people's lives.
Can I just add one thing, Jared, if that's okay?
Yeah,
I have
please.
something,
I
it
just
might be
wanna
a little
say-
bit controversial. Yeah, it might
No,
be a
go
little
ahead, go
bit
ahead.
controversial, because like the book about that, and I've seen this, like a bit of a discussion about that before, like we even mentioned it at all on our Twitter. Like the thing that makes me a little tiny bit uncomfortable is that we understand historically that there has been a Jewish, a Palestinian solidarity, and there's nothing that could obfuscate that. But if it's sort of forced in a way to say, well, we're not really enemies, we love each other, we are, we are showing you again that we are, it sounds a little bit like, well, we like white people writing a book about how they are not racist and they love Black people and they express solidarity with Black people. But imagine that during a time there is lynching of Black people, right? I honestly have to say this. It is a very uncomfortable conversation. And even, M as well has published on this. Plenty of people have opened a conversation on this, but I can't express it enough, is that it's very uncomfortable to sort of have the assumption that there is even a problem between like the Jewish, activists and Palestinian activists. It is a false conflation between Zionism and Judaism. And they're engaging somewhat in that because they're assuming that there is some sort of like lack of clarity on that. But there isn't lack of clarity on that. We know there's no issue. So there's this idea that like, well, if you're not really engaging anything material to stop the genocide, but all you're engaging with is to say, well, actually, we're not part of that. We do not support what's happening. We love you guys and we support you and we stand in solidarity with you. Like at the time of and during genocide, this is very uncomfortable for the Palestinian. Like, what am I supposed to do with that solidarity that is expressed in that moment that doesn't extend to action and doesn't extend to material action? Nothing more than a symbolic. If you're publishing a book on that as well, so like we can use words like revolutionary love, we can use all sorts of things like that, but it's an uncomfortable conversation we're going to have. Like these things, in fact, are contributing to that conflation between Zionism and Judaism. And that is, in fact, also another element of Zionism, is to conflate, like, so people can start feeling like the moment they criticize Zionism that it's anti-Semitic and all of that, which is, a layer and layer of the history of, the fight, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism was meant to do that strictly. The universities, I think NYU was it, that was saying something like, oh, you can't really criticize Zionism or Zionists because it's a protected category. Like, right. All of this, I feel like in a softer manner, such books also help normalize that stuff, because it makes an assumption that there is an enmity or there is like some sort of issue that actually doesn't exist, not for Palestinians, at least, So like it's very uncomfortable. Let's say I won't use any other word, but it's very uncomfortable to see such books get platformed.
Jared, I'll just add one last thing, but I'm going to make it quick, I promise. I feel like we all, Bana and I started and we were like, yeah, we're going to have time for lots of discussion. We get riled up, we get excited to talk. I just wanted to add, I think that one of the things about this that's like important for folks to know is part of the like frustration that comes with these kinds of things and why we talk about them on podcasts and on social media and elsewhere is because like good faith actors engage with criticism, right? Or let's not say that, that's quite judgmental. People who are open to criticism, engage with criticism, right? Like on a personal level, like if somebody reached out to you, and in fact, I know this has happened because you've mentioned it in other interviews, even that you've done with us, that folks have reached out to you and said, maybe consider reading this or looking at this. And folks do that to us as well. And especially when, a lot of times it comes from folks who end up being our friends, and we try to take the time to think about that and do it. And nobody's perfect, right? But I think that part of the reason that it's important to have these conversations in public is because attempts to have them in private are met with silence. And in fact, attempts to have them in public are met with silence as well, right? Like, I don't want to only talk about JVP, but there was I think on the same day that Jamal Bowman, before he lost his election, condemned within our lifetime for protesting the museum that was, like, from what I understand, a reconstruction of the Nova party outside of Gaza, calling it, like, of course they were protesting it. I mean, it's like genocide propaganda. And Jamal Bowman condemned them, and within, like, condemned them, calling them anti-Semitic, right? He wasn't just condemning them for the action. Within, like, hours, if not less, there were, like, more statements from JVP in support of Jamal Bowman. Okay, they had already given their, like, support for him. No comment on the fact that he's calling some of the most prominent Palestinian activists in New York anti-Semitic when they're fighting genocide propaganda. So when folks responded to that, there was no response. When folks said, hey, this is wrong, this person is literally calling Palestinians fighting genocide, Palestinians concerned about the lives of their family members or the deaths of their family members, anti-Semitic, there was no response. And similarly with these other authors, I mean, we shared a post from one of the authors that I mentioned in our critique, and there was no response. So I think it's also important to highlight that, because folks who are, like, open to conversation, who are open to growing, who are open to, like, doing better and learning, and we all should be. And like I said, like, we can't all always be perfect. We can't all always be gracious or, get it right, even, like, the third time. But when you consistently ignore critique, it says something about your politics as well as your analysis, right? And so I think that's really important. I just wanted to add it because it's not like a unique, it's like a characteristic of what we see in these things that we're criticizing. It's not sort of like a unique thing that happens now and then that you don't get a reply. It's a systemic issue that we're trying to address.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think you all model that very well yourselves. I think, just to speak from myself, I'm not always the best at handling criticism, and I do know that a little bit about myself. It tends to depend, right? So for people, and it's relevant to some extent, because I have to believe that the people who are levying the criticism, that we actually have something shared in terms of, like, what we're politically engaged in, that, and so, like, I can see the problem, right? Because if they are shared, right? If they are approaching this saying, "Hey, we're in solidarity with Palestinians," um, and this is, then they should be open to hearing from Palestinians when Palestinians are saying, "This is actually not what we're asking you to do," right? And so for me, like, I'm responding to a criticism right now, actually, not at this moment, but earlier this morning and yesterday, but it was shared with me privately, it was shared with me. And so I'm engaging with the person who shared it, sharing my point of view on it. I will, of course, incorporate and think about their point of view. And, usually for me, because of the nature of my work, what I try to do is to reorient my practice, because honestly, I'm probably not going to go back and, like, delete a conversation that I had that they think is problematic for some reason or another, because I just think it's better to keep a sort of open record of what we've done, and also to have some respect for the people that I sat down and had a conversation with. But I do get this, and I do have, and I've had people on, Josh has had people on, where people have said, "Hey, that was kind of Zionisty," or low key, or whatever, right? And we'll talk about it, right? And we'll talk about why and what does this mean, and, like, okay, let's try not to replicate this going forward, right? And so, it's different in different spaces for organizations and for people that are not doing a platform, and where you can reorient your practice honestly at any sort of time. I think they should be very open to that sort of stuff. Sometimes people just jump into the YouTube comments and talk shit, and I tend to like block them. So there's layers of this, right? But I appreciate you bringing it up, and I do think that, yeah, that there's a. I also think the point, and I think you made it, Bana, was really good about the timing and about like thinking about these things in terms of like even the example you used, if there was a widespread incidents. I mean, it would be sort of like amid the defund protests, police writing books about like how to be kinder and gentler towards black people, and that we're not really enemies or whatever, the same point you made about white folks, and writing a book like that during lynching or whatever. It's you know I think the timing is really bad. Like I don't know. I mean, there's books that are coming out right now around fighting anti-Semitism and things like that. And obviously we need to always have that. There's always should be space for that conversation of fighting anti-Semitism. But it's just sort of a weird thing of like, why is that, like, what's the thing that we're pointing at right now in this specific moment, that is the issue. It's usually in this moment a cover or a conflation of genocide, basically. It's and I'm not suggesting that all these people are doing that, but it's sort of like, what is the why is this the conversation that we need to have at this time? And I don't know, I haven't read the books that you're referencing, so I can't like speak too deeply to it. But yeah, and I would love to, you DM me about M. Cohen's piece. I'd love to take a look at that and maybe talk to M about it. But I do think it's a strange thing, unless we're writing a piece right now to really talk about how anti-Zionism is explicitly not anti-Semitism, and here's why. Like, that seems like maybe a conversation that would be more useful from a Jewish anti-Zionist right now, right? But anyway, enough of that. I agree with your critiques and understand your disappointments and frustrations around it. So the next thing I had to talk about is really kind of wild. And I just wanted to bring this up because I thought it would be a good thing to talk to both of you about, and it sort of illustrates everything that you all are talking about, maybe on a more egregious scale. Because what this is a piece from the Atlantic, and I just want to go on record again, anytime I would talk about the Atlantic, that the Atlantic is a openly, intentionally kind of liberal counterinsurgency apparatus. Like, it understands itself in that way. It is, I think the editor in chief is Jeffrey Goldberg, who was a former IOF prison guard, and has these criticisms of Zionism sometimes, but again, very much in the ways that you all are talking about it, whether it's a criticism of Netanyahu or a certain policy or the settlements, maybe things like this. But the Atlantic also was one of the key media organizations in vetting and speaking about in glowing terms of the United States' official counterinsurgency manual. And that manual, of course, brought together human rights organizations, media organizations, NGOs, and military, U.S. military, and also just sort of global counterinsurgency experts, including people like David Kilcullen, who's an Australian counterinsurgency expert. And the thing that I would say is, they at the time that vetting happened, they referred to it as like the best and most open exchange of ideas that they had ever encountered in working with the U.S. military. And so I just wanted to show a piece to show kind of what counterinsurgency writing can look like for an example, for folks, and we could talk about it a little bit. First, I will share these quick screenshots, which people who watch the show will probably be familiar with, but hang on, that's not the one I want to show first. Oh, wait. Yeah, it is. Okay. So this is again from the Ungovernable Society by Gregor Chamayou. It is about kind of development of corporate counterinsurgency in the 1970s. And he's using here basically a sketch of counterinsurgency that was provided by the experts at this time. And so it was splitting basically movements or protests into four groups. The radicals, they want to change the system, they have underlying socio-economical political motives, are hostile to enterprise as such. He's thinking about it in a business context, that's why he references enterprise. And maybe extremist or violent with them, there is nothing to be done. Then there's the opportunists. They offer visibility, power, followers, and perhaps even employment. The key to dealing with opportunists is to provide them with at least the perception of a partial victory. The idealists, these people are usually naive and altruistic. Again, this is like how the counterinsurgents are describing them, right? They apply an ethical and moral standard. The problem with them is that they are sincere and as a result very credible, except they are also credulous. It can be shown that their opposition to an industry or its products causes harm to others and cannot be ethically justified. They are forced to change their position. That last point is important to some extent, right? Because it's like if in the context of what we'll get to, right? If an idealist is shown that their opposition to, say, the Democratic Party causes harm to others and cannot be ethically justified, they are forced to change their position, right? And so that's the strategy that, for instance, Democrats use constantly towards more idealistic thinkers to say, well, what about Trump, right? Like if you don't vote for us, you're going to get something worse, and you can't ethically justify the harm that's going to be committed by this other person. And then there's the realists, as they write, these are a godsend. They can live with trade-offs. They are willing to work within the system, and want to work within the system, and they are not interested in radical change, but are pragmatic. All right. So I'm going to pull up this piece and just talk quickly about a couple different parts of it. And I know people are going to yell at me for even pulling up this piece as soon as they see who wrote it. Those who know. So anyways, Arash Azizi is a Iranian American, I think he would define himself as. He is certainly anti Iran. He is basically a regime change actor. You know, if Sina was here, I'm sure that he would have many much more funny names to refer to Azizi as. So, anyways, this piece just came out right after the DNC, and basically, it's him talking about how the promise and everything of the uncommitted movement, right? So he talked about the convention as birthing this new movement, right? The most impressive pro-Palestinian effort at the DNC was organized by the uncommitted national movement. Goes into some of the background, right? Translated into 30 delegates. Behind the scenes, uncommitted had been negotiating with Democratic Party leaders for days. It was able to secure a first ever panel at a Democratic convention about Palestinian human rights. Instead of merely protesting beyond the security perimeter, the uncommitted delegates worked the halls, their buttons and keffiyehs, making them a visible presence, and signed up hundreds of ceasefire delegates. supporting the movement's demand for a permanent ceasefire. Then you get into part of what he likes about this movement. Some progressive Zionists also backed this request. It included liberal pro-advocacy groups J Street and Americans for Peace Now. I'm sure you all will have some comments there. Hadar Susskind, the latter's president and CEO and former sergeant in the Israeli Defense Forces, called the absence of a Palestinian American speaker a mistake, not just a political one, but a moral one. Then they talk about somebody who has a hostage, right? This is always, the Democrats have to talk about that all the time. Uncommitted showed remarkable message discipline and highlighted a set of demands that, unlike many of those in the pro-Palestinian demonstrations over the past few months, could have been shared by many Zionists and Israelis, right? So, and they note this is the unexpected solidarity, right, that ran both ways. All right, I'm gonna move down a little bit. They complain a little bit about hecklers. They bring up the representative from Georgia who was supposed to give the speech. The note that the speech avoided the contentious term genocide. And then they talk about, it's like you need only compare this rhetoric to what was on display at the People's Conference for Palestine held in May in Detroit, and addressed by Rashida Tlaib to appreciate the difference. That meeting included an open call that mocked all backers of Zionism, Israel, and U.S. imperialism. It featured speakers lauding the October 7th attacks by Hamas and had sponsors supportive of dictatorships in Russia and China. Such groups often dominate the pro-Palestinian messaging in U.S. politics and have helped secure its marginality. So I put here, like, isolate the radicals, right? Like, this is the counterinsurgency approach in action and writing. There's more, but let's see who's Yaqub. So Salim Yaqub, Palestinian American soldier, historian, not soldier, told me he supported Uncommitted's demand for a speaker and was impressed with its wide spectrum of support among Democrats. He was not impressed that the demand went, or he was not surprised that the demand went unheeded because, quote, the Harris campaign believed it was staging a virtually flawless convention and didn't want to do anything that could possibly interrupt the momentum or sound a discordant note, end quote. Yaqub also told me that he was cautiously optimistic that this sort of organizing we've seen over the last several months can make a small but positive difference in U.S. policy on the issue, provided Harris wins the election, right? Of course, it only happens if Harris wins the election. So that's, again, he is crystal clear that a victory for Donald Trump would entail certainly disastrous policies on Palestine. I just asked, as opposed to this administration. And then Joanne Mort, board member of American Peace Now and a longtime activist, is excited about the possibility of a coalition between pro-Palestinian and progressive Zionist movements. A founding member of DSA in the 80s, Mort left the organization long ago and has been dismayed by the left's entrenched anti-Israeli attitudes. DSA too anti-Zionist for her. There should have been a voice given on the main stage for Palestinian American anguish, she told me. But I also think that the pro-Palestinian movement must include voices like mine, progressive Zionists who urgently want self-determination for two peoples, Israeli and Palestinian. This can be the mainstream of the movement. Let's see if there's any more. There's, I think, one other thing so if the pro-Palestinian movement in the U.S. sets aside its campaign to delegitimize Israel and question its right to exist, it can find reliable allies in the mainstream of American politics to support a future of peace and coexistence for both the national communities between the river and the sea. It could take a cue from Senator Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez, two Democratic socialists who have moved from protest to politics. This phrase, by the way, has been coming up over and over again. Bayard Rustin, initially said it. I've seen it said repeatedly about AOC lately. by the through the DNCs, through the Democrats' embrace of her, as to quote Jill Stein, now AOC Pelosi. Anyway, that was kind of the stuff I wanted to pull up and talk about within it. You can see within it, I'll just pull up one more thing quickly. Hang on. Because we can go back then to think about this alongside after that point in Shan Liyu's book where he talks about those 4 different categories, right? He writes, faced with the protest, the way forward is always the same: to negotiate with the realists, knowing that in most issues it is the solution agreed upon by the realists which is accepted, especially when business participates in the decision-making process. You could put the DNC in exchange, or the Democrats in exchange for business in this, comment. Also, the idealists need to be re-educated. I always love their use of re-education into realists. An educational process, according to Duchin, which requires great sensitivity and understanding from the educator. If you can manage to work with the realists and re-educate the idealists, they switch over to your position. Once these critics of conscience have been turned, the radicals will lose the broad credibility that the support of these moral authorities have conferred on them. Without support from the realists and idealists, the position of radicals and opportunists are seen to be shallow and self-serving. At this point, you will always be able to count on the opportunists to accept the final compromise. The premise is that radicals derive their strength only by drawing closer to more moderate blocs. Without the link, they are negligible. Radicals, isolated in their niche radicalism, are harmless and pose no threat. A bit of minority folklore without any impact. Such then is the general strategy: to cooperate with the realists, to converse with the idealists so as to convert them into realists, and to isolate the radicals and gobble up the opportunists. So again, this is just them describing in their own terms what they try to do. It doesn't necessarily, we don't have to agree with all of their characterizations. But yeah, y'all go ahead and take it away.
Oh my gosh, I was losing it while I was listening to it, partly because of the text itself, partly how you're reading it. So it's funny, but it's not, right? It's funny, but it's devastating. I was just talking back, messaging with Bana as well about the terms message discipline. I mean, let me see, what else did I write here? Oh, yeah. I mean, okay, Jared, there's so much to say about it. I'm going to note the time and I'm going to limit myself so I don't talk forever, because there's so much to say about it. So, one of the things, not even yet getting into the counterinsurgency bit, but, or maybe, yeah, I mean, it relates. I remember when we saw, the first time I saw this thing of ceasefire delegates referring to the, okay, that was a hilarious comment. I'm referring to the, the people who they got to sign the petition in support of a ceasefire or something, right? And I think that representative was online talking about that, calling these people ceasefire delegates. And I was asking people, what does this mean? What does this actually mean? Does it mean they withheld their votes? Of course, by that time, the convention was over. They did not withhold their votes. I mean, that would have been great. That would have been great. But it's this kind, I think at the time, I don't remember if I said it to myself or if I wrote it down or what, but, there's that Cabral quote that's tell no lies, claim no easy victories. I mean, what does it mean to say, oh, we got 300 ceasefire delegates? Okay. What? These terms, some of these terms, that and message discipline, I wrote to myself while you were talking, that one of the things that has come out of the last 11 months has been this incredible creativity for wordsmithing that I never knew people were capable of. I mean, just the passive voice, the combos, they are I mean, even the concept of ceasefire, wild. So yeah, and then also some other notes I made to myself was the thing about the pro-Palestine movement, whatever that means, must include voices like mine. And that was someone from Americans for Peace Now, I think. I mean, even the fact that Peace Now as an organization was mentioned 2 distinct times is notable. Yeah, it's wild. I mean, I know you're talking a little bit about like the Atlantic sort of as the Atlantic, and then like, I don't know, to talk a little bit about like this kind of news media. I mean, like I said, the word creativity has been just off the charts. The kinds of analysis that people are coming to, the just divorce. It's like we're in different universes. I mean, even this, like we already talked about it at the beginning, but even this idea that Palestinians can gain something, and like we don't know what it is. I don't think the article says, but that we can gain something by giving everything up, basically, like by giving our blind commitment and membership to a party that has enacted our genocide, and then making sure that we include voices like the people in Americans for Peace Now or Peace Now who maybe like don't kind of support like a what's the word that I want to use, like unrestrained genocide. But I think it would be like remiss of me not to say here, because I don't think that I've said it in previous interviews, like when we talk about genocide now in Gaza, it's really important that we understand it in the larger context, because like you said, like, or like you read in that article, they say, oh, they didn't use this controversial term genocide, right? And like people have been having this conversation, is it controversial to refer to, you know, the mass murder, the withholding of water and food, electricity, destroying hospitals, destroying schools, destroying shelter, targeting like children and doctors and literally everyone else? Is that genocide? And that's a conversation. But the real conversation for people who are paying attention and care about history and care about words should be that it has been a genocide in Palestine. Like, of course, not to in any way diminish that this is a genocide, a fast genocide, and we're seeing, I think it's something 10% of the population of Gaza has either been murdered, injured, or like removed, like basically is no longer in Gaza. But yeah, the genocide in Palestine has been ongoing for a long time, right? Because you had the mass forced exodus in or exile in 1948. Before that, there were massacres and arrests by the British, by the Zionists. Since then, there has only been ongoing murder, arrest, torture, and it's very systematic, right? It's like in the way that genocide is supposed to be. And so that's really important to say, you know, that like some of this conversation in the media, whether it's the Atlantic or even, you know, like Democracy Now, which comparatively is a much better like platform or whatever. Anyway, it's not the same, but news media, it's totally divorced from the history and the reality on the ground, and it serves to normalize these perspectives that are also divorced from the history and the reality on the ground, like Peace Now. I think the protest to politics thing is like very interesting as well, and I didn't notice it when I first read the piece, and such interesting kind of way to praise this move to like quote unquote pragmatism. Let me just look at my actual notes. I wrote not just
Yeah, while you're doing that,
Okay.
I do want to say one other thing, because it's like I mean, one, I think that the genocide point that you bring up is very important. It's something that I've often grappled with in terms of like even narrating, right? As you're like counting the days, right? Of like,
Yeah.
you know, it's like we can count the days since October 7th, of course. And, you know, there's meaning to that because of the level of assault that people have been under that needs to cease, right? And we all want that to stop immediately, months ago, etc. But but like it is a tricky part. Like even in titling conversations, often I'm like, do I say the day because it's been going on for 76 years? It's like, and I do think that it is, it's important to understand the kind of continuity of genocide within, what we would call Israeli policy, right? And that's part of why it doesn't just show up out of the blue. It's been there, and a lot of their doctrines and whatnot that are even, you know, whether it's Dahiya doctrine or what else, right? These are based upon, very genocidal ways of thinking. I mean, there was that ridiculous podcast the other day that where those guys, I guess, were trying to go viral by talking about um being Israeli and how they believed everybody within Israel society, if they could, I don't know if you both saw this, would push the button that would destroy all Palestinians if they could, right?
Mhm.
Like, you know, um, so anyways, I agree with that point. The other thing I did want to say too about this piece, right? Because it's obviously a terrible piece and we don't agree with any of it. But the thing I found most interesting in some ways was how they're open about the fact that they think Zionists need to be in the Palestinian movement, right? Like this is not even so in some ways it's like a more stark or honest version of the critique that you all start from their point of view of the critique that you all have, right, of saying some of these anti-Zionist organizations actually, contain Zionists and contain Zionists viewpoints, right, within how they define anti-Zionism or how they think about these things, and that there's fundamental contradictions here. They're even taking it a step further and saying like, no, we need Israelis, we need Zionists to be a part of a movement for Palestine, right? Which is just, again, it kind of, I think, gives away the sort of agenda there of control and co-optation and trying to ultimately define, right, what a ceasefire or any Palestinian demand would look like within the confines of what's acceptable for Israel and the United States, basically.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that is like very, very much the danger that we're trying to sort of, I mean, I don't know, like I want to say warn against, but frankly, like in US organizing, for a long time in like legal campaigns, let's say, there has not been a significant difference in the most non-Zionist organizations' legal approaches with Peace Now, right? Because they both use this framework of, and Bana like discussed this, but I was kind of planning on bringing it up here as well, that anyone who uses this framework of either, well, we have to operate within, the human rights law or humanitarian law, right? That it's 1967 is the period of military occupation that we're talking about. We're normalizing the state of Israel from 1948. This is like the international law approach that every major organization uses in the United States. And why do they use it? Because they've resigned themselves, as Bana also discussed, to the fact that Democrats, because we're not even talking about Republicans, not ever. If there's a Republican, we won't even launch the campaign. This is like the conversation that I hear, or heard, I should say, that this is the best we can expect from Democrats, that maybe they will honor international law sometimes if it suits them, and if it can be gotten away with, because of course we can't make it political. This is like the converse, And so, yeah, I mean, I think like on the one hand, I want to say like, this is wild. And like, of course, no pro-Palestinian movement, no real one can have like someone like Peace Now or Zionists. But at the same time, like if we look materially at the requests that many organizations that are Palestine aligned or would call themselves pro-Palestine, like functionally they are using the same basis, right? So I think this is what, I mean, I think these are what the attempts at counterinsurgency through articles like this are trying to respond to, is that in this moment, there's sort of been a renewed attempt by Palestinian organizers, by anti-Zionists, by people who have a more like grounded approach and understand that in order to get what we need and what we deserve, that we need to move away from these restricted ideas of what we can achieve. I think that those, you know, those people who are growing in power and growing in influence and, you know, able to mobilize more people and able to speak more freely, well, depending on the context, are willing to speak more freely, let's say, I think they really scare a lot of these organizations. I mean, why else would someone from Peace Now need to say that they need to be included? I think just a few years ago, they probably would have thought of themselves as included, and that it went without saying. So I think that's like part of the reason for articles like this, right? That we need that there is a danger that's being addressed, like a danger for Zionism and for American imperialism that they're trying to address and co-opt. Like even before the thing, like even if the goal is, yes, Palestinians will give up their goals for nothing and join the Democrats. But maybe that's the ideal. But before that, there has to be this thing that, yeah, like you pointed out, that we can marginalize the quote unquote like radical. But I thought it was so interesting because I listened to your interview with Lara Shiha, where you talked about these like categories. And I thought it was so interesting because I feel like being in Palestine, and even before I lived here, you can see I mean, it is like a meaningful categorization of people and the way they're manipulated, right? You can see that there are people who are committed to their principles, that there are people who come here, you know, that they're like more like idealists who come here and see things and think, oh my God, Palestinians deserve freedom. Palestinians deserve their homes, like things that we might all think if we saw some of the horrors here. And then opportunists and, you know, realists. I even hate the word realists, but like pragmatism. But I think not only can we, like personally, I've seen it where I see people come here and go through this process of becoming realists. And then they get brought into these NGOs because those are the organizing spaces that at least have existed, let's say in the US and the UK and Canada, that they're brought into these. And then they're either, I don't remember exactly what the text was, but it was something like delicately shaped into realists or something like that. And that's really what, like, you do see that happen a lot, right? Where folks are told, well, we have to limit our request to this because this is what we could maybe win. Or we have to use international law because that's what the funded organizations or our funded organization allows us to do. Why? Because those are the limitations that the funder sets on us, right? What often that's not said out loud, but that's the reason. So either they're turned into pragmatists, into realists in that way, and their energy is sort of drawn away. And I'm not saying that every organization, by the way, like I actually wanted to say, you know, I'm making these critiques of JVP, if not now is included in there, JFREG is included in there, but also Palestinian organizations are also guilty of this, right? Not just in the US, but also in Palestine, in the way their funding happens and the way they, some of them organize their advocacy campaigns according to these restrictions, because that's how they get their funding, right? This is also a problem. It doesn't mean that everyone working in the organizations in Palestine or the people who are part of these organizations in the US are aligned with that or believe in that, right? There are lots of people who are part of JVP who I not only respect but like, or who are part of other organizations that I like, but there is a difference between their politics and the organization that gets the money and hires the people and allocates the funds. And that's really important. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But so I just wanted to say that because I don't want I don't like these like blanket condemnations, and I don't think that they help people. But yeah, I think that intentionally or not, in the NGO spaces, this happens so much of the time. And also, like, organizing becomes a career, right? But I also wanted to say that there's another thing that happens sometimes, two other things. One is, if you refuse to, like, if you're misidentified as an idealist, then you're actually a radical and you can't be changed into a pragmatist. What happens? You're sidelined, right? Which the article talks about a little bit. But often, like, also sidelined by these organizations which refuse critique. And a good example of that is DSA and the Palestine Solidarity Working Group, which just completely sidelined like a number of very good, very capable, very committed organizers. And like, also, this was part of a organized media campaign. NGOs took part in this, and we can talk about that. But that's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is, like, I was thinking about this as I was sort of thinking about your questions, that I think there's also like this other kind of counterinsurgency, or maybe I just don't know enough about it, but talking about this idea of humanism and this critique of the left that we're not human enough. I think there's like this other thing that happens where idealists, maybe it's just what you described, that idealists are convinced into like becoming unable to do anything, because doing anything means you're hurting someone. And like, what does that mean? I mean, I don't know. It's just something I was thinking about. But I wanted to like just end my point here, because although, like I said, like, there are people in JVP who I very much respect, and other organizations, but in this case, talking about JVP, like students who were part of these encampments for months and months and months, and risked their access to education, in some case their funding, their jobs, maybe their future careers, definitely the ability to travel here, a lot of them. And I think that this organization does really turn people from idealists into pragmatists, generally doing things like lobbying work or operating within the scope of what Democrats will accept and so on. And also, as we talked about in What Constitutes Zionism and Anti-Zionism, co-organizes with Zionist organizations, like If Not Now, founded, by the way, in part by Joshua Leifer, I should note. But they also kind of create a monopoly over the space. And so one of the things that we've been talking about, and that I would invite your listeners to really think about, is that as students are heading back to the university, that they should resist this like co-optation and kind of franchising of Zionism in their spaces, because they're giving up so much. And we see what this pragmatist approach does, that it wins nothing for nothing. And that folks should, like people kind of disengage from electoral politics, they should also disengage from the franchisement of Zionism. And they should rename their chapters. They should rename their organizations, because these organizations, the ones that are handling the funding and allocating it and doing all of this, they're not taking on the same kinds of risks that the people are, and they're also not taking the same kinds of principled stands, but they take credit for the principled stands. And so I know I talked much longer than I meant to, but I think that's something really important, and that's one way that folks can sort of take their power back. And I will just make a joke to end it. For anyone who's seen The Office, there's a joke, Michael Scott makes his own paper company, and they want to buy his paper company from him, if anyone's seen it. And he says, they're trying to sell it. They say it's going to go out of business. And he says, well, I can start another one. I have no shortage of names. And that's how we should, that's how we need to behave a little bit, right? That we can't be co-opted, that our efforts shouldn't be turned into something less than there are, that we have agency and we have power and we can use it, and we can build our own principled organizations that have trust and have, have something else behind them. And we can be like Michael Scott.
Awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Banna.
I love the last bit. I was just thinking that's such a good way to end that. Just wanted to add just one last thing about some of the limits of like broad movements, like mass movements, is that they do contain all the four like elements of organizers, like the, you know, opportunists, the radicals, the realists, and the idealists. So you'll find anybody, you'll find even the Zionists, liberal Zionists, even, you know, the anti-Zionists, everybody, you know, they'll all be included in a broad movement. That's what broad movements are meant to be. They're meant to make you feel like there is space for inclusion, and there's no space for alienation. And you obviously, in the process of building the movement, you're in a hope that people are going to be moving towards sort of at least radical politics if they didn't have that, right? But usually what happens, they don't really move into that. Usually counterinsurgency gets involved, and then all of this gets dispersed, right? You have the, you know, opportunists being opportunists, but also the idealists losing hope and being demoralized because there's nothing really happening. And then they become realists, start asking for like pragmatist things, or what can be achievable, what can be doable, and instead of reaching for the stars, which they should be doing. And then, you know, the radicals get isolated, and then they get, you know, again, sidelined, right? So that happens. That there are reasons, of course, why this happens. It happens really for three reasons. One is the coexistence of these different groups creates an ideological incoherence, really, in the actual like movement, right? So if there's an incoherence there, technically you will have people co-opt things easily, right? Because if the, let's say, the powerful party is the opportunists, right, or idealists, right, they have the resources, they are the organizers that have lots of, you know, money, funding, and whatnot. And if they are the ones that say that they have the more power, they are going to be easily co-opting the movement towards their own politics or ideologies that wouldn't be, let's say, radical, because usually the radicals aren't the ones that are, you know, supported with resources. Unfortunately, that's the case. It's just how it is. So that happens, but also another layer of it is the also like the structural incoherence as well, right? Because broad movements usually don't have like a certain structure, like there's no like one leader, right? So what happens is that there's no accountability, right? If there's no accountability, how do we say, like, how do we have political reflexivity? How do we build the, let's say, or create an ideological coherence, right? So these that ends up happening. But the last thing that I would say that is causing the issue is mainly having, you know, all of these different forces, you know, fighting as well between them for that hegemony of the mass movement. It happens, whether we want to admit it or not. There's always going to be internal fights. People want to be the ones representing the movement, and that happens in US organizing spaces. Like one, you know, NGO wants to have the say in everything, or you know, they want to make sure that one organization does not, you know, or making sure that they always have a say, or making sure that they include certain ideas, certain organizers, certain people, certain, because they don't want to exclude others. So there are always going to be fights. So these three reasons, I would say, are the reason why we have somewhat, you know, we're always going to arrive at a situation where the mass movement is going to fall apart the moment there is a counterinsurgency effort. So we either look into those things and obviously get demoralized and go into the camp of pragmatists, which is what's happening at the moment, unfortunately. You know, pragmatism is on the rise. People are just saying, whatever it is, a symbolic win, whatever we can get, we can get. This is what we're at. I think what we need to do is we need to bring back that at least some, you know, like revolutionary potential that was there at least. I mean, I, for example, thought, you know, the encampments were great. I mean, even like resistance themselves, like resistance, like, you know, were praising the encampments, saying that these are like, you know, resistance abroad. So like this is very important. I think we need to also be aware that that we shouldn't fall into hopelessness and defeatism, because that's not, that's also, a product of counterinsurgency, and we don't have the privilege of that during genocide, right? Because we have to stop the genocide. Again, the person with the hand in water and the hand in fire, right? So we have to we have to admit that, hopelessness and helplessness is not going to be helpful. The last thing I would like to mention is, at least for us at the GSC, we always receive media calls to talk about things and conduct interviews. And we're very clear about our policy, right? We're like, we do not engage in discussions where Zionists are also platformed, where, liberal Zionists are platforms. And usually they would bring back, and this happened recently, where we were brought back an article and they're like, look, we didn't include settlers or Zionists because the discussion was on settler violence. But what they brought in was like a B'Tselem speaker and a Peace Now speaker and some other, peace organization. And they don't understand that for us, that is also Zionism. So like, you have to like understand that, like, it's everywhere. It's everywhere, this thing of like, this lack of understanding of Zionism, but also an expectation that the desperation in Palestinians will let them participate in this circus, that they will let them participate in this neoliberal theatrics of, we'll have you on the article, but we'll also quote 3 other people just to balance, right? To have a balanced view on things. Like, balanced view during genocide sounds very, very like just nihilistic, sorry, and just, how do I say it? Just it's like putting salt on the wound for Palestinians, right? Because not only are you experiencing genocide and you're not platformed anywhere, the moment you're platformed, there's always going to be having a person to balance you out, right? So that is also counterinsurgency, because you're not really allowing the Palestinians to speak. You're only allowing the Palestinians to speak as long as they offer something that you agree with, otherwise we're going to always be the adversarial, right? The adversarial that gets invited on a media platform to sound like they're so violent and childish and radical and just disrespectful, or what do you call it, like the opposite of respectability politics, the opposite of that, so like, we're not prescribing to those things. So we get platformed only because they have to provide the other side of the view. They must. In fact, we are the ones that they're forced to platform, because the Zionists are always platformed, right? There's no like exclusion of them. So it's just to say that, like, counterinsurgency, unfortunately, is still a tactic, and we must not fall into defeatism. That is the most important thing. People need to come out of conversations. People need to come out of things saying, look, we are, this is what the case of the movement, this is what the uncommitted movement did, but we're going to put this aside. And as Lara said, we're going to reorganize ourselves, bring back the spirit, and let's do it all over again. Let's bring back the radical spirit. Let's not let the idealists take over. I call them the anxious people. I feel like they're just anxious people, like all the time, And then the pragmatists, realists, and then opportunists are going to have to be pushed out. That's the most important thing, is realizing that those people are not helpful for the movement. And once that's the clarity sets, and I know that the urgency of genocide is clear, all of this will fall into place, and we're going to have a movement that isn't hijackable, if I may say.
Yeah, a few things. I mean, great comments. I have some thoughts. One, I appreciate the notion of reorganizing. I think, Dylan Rodriguez talks about this in an interesting way, and he and our politics are slightly different, but I really appreciate his work on, counterinsurgency and thinking about these things, and love to be in dialogue with him. But he has this thing about like for him, he even questions organizations to some degree because of the ability to kind of infiltrate, control, etc. that can happen. I'm not there because I think organizations are really important, actually. But I do agree. Part of when he made that comment in one of our discussions, what he was talking about was like if you're on a college campus, right? And your organization becomes outlawed, say not outlawed, but like the university policy bans it basically, right? Or they tell the organization it can't do this or it can't do that. It's like you all don't have to actually engage as that particular organization, right? Like you can just do something else. A bunch of you leave, call yourself something else, like, so I don't think that we should allow these Zionist institutions, such as universities, these imperialist institutions, to like dictate the terms either of that. And if you get in a position where you're like fighting over whether your organization can exist or whether it um, can it do things officially and things like that, like that is it's a waste of time, but it also might be a good opportunity, as Laura is talking about, to do something different, which is to say that those of you who are like, actually, a lot of the reasons that we chose to be in this organization or define ourselves in this way was because we were trying to appeal to be allowed some sort of institutional place within this campus or whatever. And we don't actually have to organize or struggle on these terms. We can define our own terms and be much more disciplined, actually, to use the term that Azizi used, in a very different way, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think the point on the encampments is a good one. I think I will say this: when I started to reach out to you all on this, and I had a couple conversations related to the DNC recently. I think that the moment of that moment, where you're watching the uncommitted movement, where you're seeing, you know, the protests outside be very isolated and smaller than we would hope, probably, right? And um, that it is easy in those moments to feel despair, right? Or to feel like, but I don't think that people should also, like, I think people should approach it as, look, the people who are engaging in electoralism and who are going to try to do that, like, they're going to try to do that. We don't need to help them with that. Like, that it frees us up to do something much more committed and disciplined in terms of how we are working together in our spaces, right? And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I am also hopeful that, you know, I feel two different ways about the encampments. On one level, I feel like I wish that there was more happening outside of and beyond university campuses. And I know there's a lot happening. People are doing really good work to like raise money and like try to do mutual aid and get resources to Gaza. And I'm seeing that like here in Philly and other places. So there's good stuff going on there. But also I do think that the campuses are a place where we have seen more radical and militant manifestations of solidarity with Palestinians. And so I'm happy in that regard that they're back in session, and that I know those are going to be difficult struggles, but I think that's a good place of struggle at this point. And yeah, so anyways, I just wanted to say some of that in response. You all are welcome to add other stuff. I think we should probably start to wind down because we're going to approach 3 hours here in a minute. But if there's anything else either of you want to say in closing, suggestions, places for people to connect, like whatever.
Yeah, I can go first if that's okay, Vanna. Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Jared. I think like the organizing on the space of the campuses is important because it seems like it sets a tone, right? Like what happens and the discourse and the actions on campus, like around the world, but also in the US, like really can set a tone for the things that happen in the cities, like near the campuses and also across the country or across the world. So I hope the students kind of find ways to either reestablish the encampments or do something different. And I hope other folks, I think one of the important things that we were trying to call for at the time, like maybe just a bit before the height of the encampments or at that period of time, was that people really need to find ways also to support the people who are making those kinds of, risks and things, and also engage themselves. But anyway, yeah, I think that's really important. I just wanted to say, folks can find us at on Twitter at Shepherds for Good. They can find us on Instagram at Good Shepherd Collective, Facebook if anyone still uses that, and we also have a website. Our website is goodshepherdcollective.org, and we're coming out with a new website hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Part of our work over the last, especially the last year, has been trying to make data more accessible, because folks might not know this, but data in Palestine, there's constantly data being collected. It is across these sort of arbitrary lines. Most of the data is coming from East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, but sometimes there's more. But it's not really available for everyone, especially daily data and things like that. So that's been part of our work over the last year. And when the new website comes out, that's going to be a really important part of it. You've already seen it, right, Jared? So yeah, thanks.
I have had a sneak peek, and yeah, it's great. I can't wait until it's out so people can see it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your help. And then I'll just say, I really hope that folks find ways that they can plug in and think about these questions. And I know that it can seem overwhelming. Some of the critiques that we have might be different, or it's a lot to think about, right? But I think folks can really imagine what kind of impact they can have on the ground, and then organize ways to do that in their own local communities. And I'll just say, in the meantime, while you're doing that, you can go to gazafunds.com. You can look at workshops for Gaza to learn something and donate. And both of those have fundraisers if you're lost in the sea of fundraisers from Gaza to choose from.
Yeah, that's great. Banna, did you want to offer anything?
Not much really, but we have been talking between us about creating or having a webinar about defeatism and all of that in the movement. And I think it's quite very important to sort of think and about what does it mean to have anti-Zionist praxis beyond just the critique of okay, yes, we this is what anti-Zionism is, this is what Zionism is. I think it's important to be well, this is what anti-Zionist praxis looks like, but also how we can avoid falling into defeatist politics and helplessness and all of that. I think it's a conversation that we'd like people to join, because we need to have the movement rejuvenated. I think we are going to see some of that because we're back on campuses, but I think it's important that people join that conversation, because the more people join that, the more people will come out of that feeling more of that power and agency, and no longer feel demoralized. And I think that's probably the most important task we can all make as organizers, really, at this difficult time, because the genocide has been unfortunately normalized. So I think we don't want that. And our comrades in Gaza are calling for us, and we want, people to join that conversation if they can. We haven't yet set the date, but stay tuned on our Twitter and Instagram. And hopefully we'll have that sometime soon. And you're also welcome, Jared, as well.
That sounds great, and I would love to attend and help promote it or support it in any way that I can. All right, well, thank you so much. I know we had one other topic that we kind of wanted to talk about, and maybe we'll save that for another discussion, but it's been really great. We've covered a lot, and I really appreciate both of you. I think you both said a lot of really important things today, and I'm just grateful to be in conversation with you, and to learn from you both. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jared. Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you, Jared. And thanks for the listeners as well, who stayed with us for 3 hours. That's great work.
Absolutely.
I would not stay for 3 hours for a talk. I mean, great. I love everybody, but I think the most I've done is 2 hours. But I really respect those who've literally stayed with us and had conversations with us in the chat. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you all in a free Palestine, inshallah.
Inshallah. All right. Thank you.